What if I told you that while your ancestors were living in mud huts and struggling to survive, an empire on the other side of the world was performing brain surgery, building structures that would outlast every civilization to come, and creating a society so advanced that we're still trying to understand how they did it? The ancient Egyptians didn't just build pyramids, they built an empire that lasted longer than the entire history of Christianity, 3,000 years. To put that in perspective, the time between Cleopatra and the iPhone is shorter than the time between Cleopatra and the construction of the Great Pyramid. This is their story. And it's far stranger than anything you learned in school. Picture the Nile River around 5000 BCE. While Europe was still deep in the Stone Age, something extraordinary was happening along this ribbon of water, cutting through the Sahara Desert. The Nile wasn't just a river. It was a clock, a calendar, and a god all rolled into one. Every single year, like clockwork, it would flood. But here's what made it different from every other river system on Earth. It was predictable. The ancient Egyptians could set their watches by it, if they had watches. When the waters receded, they left behind a gift, a thick layer of nutrient-rich silt that turned the desert into the most fertile farmland on the planet.
Kemet.
The Egyptians called this black soil Kemet, which literally means the black land. Everything beyond it, that was Deshret, the red land, the desert of death. This wasn't luck. This was geography creating destiny. Small villages began appearing along the Nile's banks. Farmers weren't just surviving anymore, they were thriving. And when people have enough to eat, something interesting happens. They start thinking about bigger questions. Questions like, what happens when we die? And how do we make sure we're remembered? By 3100 BCE, a king named Narmer, also called Menes, did something that would echo through millennia. He unified Upper and Lower Egypt into a single kingdom. But he didn't just conquer, he created an idea that would define Egyptian civilization forever, the concept of the divine pharaoh. Here's where it gets fascinating. The pharaoh wasn't just a king who claimed to speak for the gods. He was a god, walking among mortals. Specifically, he was the living embodiment of Horus, the falcon-headed sky god. When he died, he would become Osiris, the god of the afterlife. This wasn't metaphor to the Egyptians. This was literal truth. Think about the psychological power of that. You're not just obeying a ruler, you're obeying a god. Rebellion isn't just treason, it's blasphemy. This single idea gave Egypt a political stability that would be the envy of every civilization that came after. But the early dynasties weren't just about power and religion. They were innovating at a pace that would make Silicon Valley jealous. Around 3200 BCE, the Egyptians developed one of the world's first writing systems, hieroglyphics. These weren't just pretty pictures. They were a sophisticated combination of phonetic and ideographic symbols that could express complex abstract thoughts. The word hieroglyph literally means sacred carving, and the Egyptians believed writing itself was a gift from Thoth, the god of wisdom. Here's something that will blow your mind. We can read the names of individual Egyptian accountants from 5,000 years ago. We know what they ate for breakfast, what they complained about, and what jokes they wrote in the margins of their papyrus scrolls. That's the power of written language. It makes you immortal. And speaking of immortality, let's talk about what the Egyptians are most famous for. The Great Pyramid of Giza. You've seen the photos. You think you know the story, you don't. In 2560 BCE, Pharaoh Khufu decided he wanted to build a tomb. Not just any tomb, the biggest, most ambitious construction project in human history. And here's what nobody tells you. He actually pulled it off. The Great Pyramid contains approximately 2.3 million limestone blocks. Each block weighs an average of 2.5 tons. Some of the granite blocks in the King's Chamber weigh up to 80 tons. The entire structure weighs about 6 million tons. Now, let me give you some perspective that will make you question everything. The pyramid was built in roughly 20 years. That means workers had to quarry, transport, and precisely place one block every 2 minutes, 24 hours a day, for 2 decades straight. How? For centuries. People have proposed increasingly ridiculous theories. Aliens, lost technology, acoustic levitation, magic. Here's the truth, and it's far more impressive than any conspiracy theory. They used human ingenuity, mathematics, and an organizational structure that wouldn't be matched until the Roman Empire. Recent archaeological discoveries have completely rewritten what we thought we knew. The workers weren't slaves, they were paid laborers. We've found their villages, their cemeteries, and their medical records. These men were well fed, received health care, and were given honorable burials when they died on the job. Graffiti left by work gangs shows they were organized into competing teams with names like Friends of Khufu and Drunkards of Menkaure. They took pride in their work. They were building a stairway to heaven for a living god. But here's the engineering marvel nobody talks about: the precision. The base of the Great Pyramid is level to within 2.1 centimeters across its 230-meter length. The sides are aligned to true north with an accuracy of 3/60 of a single degree. We're talking about tolerances that would be impressive with modern laser equipment achieved with copper tools and wooden measuring rods. The Egyptians had discovered advanced mathematics. They knew pi, though they didn't call it that. They understood the relationship between a circle's circumference and its diameter. They used the Pythagorean theorem 1,000 years before Pythagoras was born. They had invented practical geometry, literally earth measurement, to rebuild property boundaries after the Nile's annual floods. But pyramids weren't just mathematical achievements. They were theological statements. The shape itself was sacred. It represented the primordial mound that emerged from the waters of chaos at the moment of creation. The pyramid's peak was meant to pierce the sky, creating a physical connection between Earth and the heavens. The smooth limestone casing stones, most of which were stolen centuries ago, would have reflected the sun's light, making the entire structure gleam like a beacon visible for miles across the desert. Khufu's son, Khafra, built the second pyramid at Giza and added something extra: the Great Sphinx. Carved from a single massive outcrop of limestone, with the body of a lion and the head of a pharaoh, it became Egypt's eternal guardian. And yes, there are chambers and tunnels beneath it that we still haven't fully explored. The Old Kingdom, the age of pyramid builders, represented Egypt at the height of its power and confidence. But empires don't last forever. By 2200 BCE, climate change struck. The Nile's floods became erratic. Famines swept through the land. Central authority collapsed, and Egypt fractured into competing kingdoms. This period, called the First Intermediate Period, was Egypt's Dark Age. But here's what's remarkable: they came back. Around 2050 BCE, pharaohs of the Middle Kingdom reunified the land, and Egypt entered a golden age of art, literature, and expansion. They learned from their mistakes, building grain storage systems and irrigation networks to protect against future famines. This resilience, this ability to collapse and rebuild stronger, is what allowed Egyptian civilization to survive for 3,000 years. Everything changed in 1650 BCE when foreign invaders called the Hyksos swept into Egypt from the northeast. They brought with them technology the Egyptians had never seen: horse-drawn chariots and composite bows. For the first time in over 1,000 years, Egypt was conquered. The occupation lasted a century. And when the Egyptians finally drove the Hyksos out, they had learned a critical lesson. Isolation wouldn't protect them anymore. If they wanted to survive, they needed to become an empire. Enter the new kingdom, and the greatest pharaohs Egypt would ever produce. Thutmose III, who reigned from 1479 to 1425 BCE, was Egypt's Napoleon. He conducted at least 17 military campaigns, conquering territories from Syria to Sudan. He didn't just conquer, he created an empire with a professional standing army, strategic fortifications, and a network of vassal states that paid tribute in gold, exotic goods, and slaves. But military conquest was only part of the story. The New Kingdom pharaohs became master propagandists, using art and architecture to project power on a scale the world had never seen. Take the Temple of Karnak. This wasn't a building, it was an entire city of temples covering over 200 acres. Its hyper-style hall contains 134 massive columns, each 10 meters in circumference, covered floor to ceiling with hieroglyphic inscriptions celebrating pharaonic victories. Walking through it today, even in ruins, is like entering the mind of a civilization that believed it would last forever. Then there was Hatshepsut, one of history's most successful female rulers. When her husband died, she became regent for her young stepson. Then she did something unprecedented. She declared herself pharaoh. This created a problem. Egypt had no concept of a female pharaoh, so Hatshepsut simply redefined the rules. In her official portraits, she wore the false beard of kingship and the male royal regalia. Inscriptions referred to her using masculine pronouns. She didn't pretend to be a man. She expanded the definition of what pharaoh could be. Her 22-year reign was marked by ambitious building projects and successful trade expeditions rather than military conquest. Her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari, built into the cliffs of the Theban mountains, is considered one of the architectural masterpieces of the ancient world. But the New Kingdom's most famous pharaoh was someone who barely mattered during his lifetime: Tutankhamun. King Tut died around age 19, having accomplished virtually nothing during his short reign. He would have been completely forgotten if not for one extraordinary fact: his tomb was never robbed. When archaeologist Howard Carter broke through the sealed doorway in 1922, he became the first human in over 3,000 years to see what an intact royal burial looked like. The answer? Mind-blowing wealth, solid gold coffins, thousands of precious objects, chariots, furniture, jewelry, food, wine, board games, everything a young king might need in the afterlife. And this was for a minor pharaoh. Imagine what must have been buried with the truly great kings like Rameses II or Thutmose III, treasures that were looted in antiquity and melted down centuries ago. Speaking of Rameses II, let's talk about history's greatest self-promoter. Rameses the Great ruled for 66 years, from 1279 to 1213 BCE. He fathered over 100 children. He built more monuments and statues of himself than any other pharaoh. He fought the Hittites to a stalemate at the Battle of Kadesh, then claimed total victory and had the triumph carved into temple walls across Egypt. The guy was basically the world's first master of personal branding. But here's the thing, he backed it up. His reign represented the last period of genuine Egyptian power and prosperity. His massive temples at Abu Simbel, with 4 20-meter-high statues of himself carved into the cliff face, still inspire awe today. Yet, even as Rameses celebrated his victories, the ancient world was changing. Let's talk about what really made ancient Egypt extraordinary. Not its monuments, but its mind. The Egyptians were obsessed with cheating death, not in some abstract spiritual sense. They wanted to literally take their bodies and possessions with them into eternity. This obsession drove them to become history's first true scientists. Mummification wasn't just a religious ritual, it was cutting-edge medical technology that required detailed knowledge of human anatomy. The process took 70 days and involved removing all internal organs except the heart, which they believed contained intelligence and personality. The brain, they considered it useless and literally pulled it out through the nose with hooks. They were wrong about the brain's function, but their preservation techniques were so effective that we can perform DNA analysis on mummies today. But here's where it gets really interesting. The embalming priests weren't just preserving bodies. They were keeping detailed records of what they learned. Ancient Egyptian medical papyri contain descriptions of surgical procedures, pharmaceutical recipes, and diagnostic techniques that wouldn't be matched in Europe until the Renaissance. The Edwin Smith Papyrus, dating to around 1600 BCE is the world's oldest surgical document. It describes 48 case studies of injuries, organized from head to toe, with each case following a systematic format: diagnosis, prognosis, and treatment. Some cases are marked an ailment I will treat, others an ailment I will contest with, and some honestly state an ailment not to be treated, meaning hopeless. This was evidence-based medicine 3,500 years ago. The Egyptians performed brain surgery, set broken bones with splints, and sutured wounds with thread. They understood that the pulse was connected to the heart. They had specialists, dentists, ophthalmologists, gastroenterologists. They developed treatments for parasitic infections, which were common in the Nile River environment. And yes, they performed the world's first documented pregnancy tests. A woman would urinate on wheat and barley seeds. If the wheat grew, she was having a girl. If the barley grew, a boy. If neither grew, she wasn't pregnant. Modern testing has shown this method was actually fairly accurate for detecting pregnancy. The hormones in pregnant women's urine can indeed affect seed germination. But medicine was inseparable from magic in Egyptian thinking. Diseases were often attributed to angry gods or malevolent spirits. Treatments combined practical remedies with magical incantations. A surgeon might prescribe honey as an antibiotic, which actually works. Honey has antimicrobial properties, while also reciting spells to ward off demons. This fusion of rationality and mysticism defined Egyptian thought. They were simultaneously the world's first empiricists and its most devoted mystics. Their religion was breathtakingly complex. They worshipped hundreds of gods, each with multiple forms and overlapping responsibilities. Ra was the sun god, but he could also be Amun-Ra or Ra-Horakhti, depending on the time of day and theological interpretation. Isis was simultaneously mother, wife, sorceress, and protector of the dead. The afterlife, the Duat, was not a simple heaven or hell. It was a dangerous landscape filled with demons, lakes of fire, and hostile gods that the deceased had to navigate using spells from the Book of the Dead. Your heart would be weighed against the feather of Ma'at, the goddess of truth. If your heart was heavier, corrupted by sin, it would be devoured by Amit, the soul eater, and you would cease to exist. True death wasn't physical death, it was being forgotten. This is why the pharaohs built those massive monuments. This is why they carved their names everywhere. This is why deliberately erasing someone's name from history, what Egyptologists call damnatio memoriae, was the ultimate punishment. To be remembered was to live forever. By 1100 BCE, the Bronze Age world was collapsing. Mysterious invaders called the Sea Peoples were destroying civilizations across the Mediterranean. The Hittite Empire fell, Mycenaean Greece burned, coastal cities from Troy to Syria were abandoned. Egypt survived, but barely. The New Kingdom ended not with conquest, but with exhaustion. The empire had overextended itself. The cost of maintaining garrisons across the Near East, combined with corrupt officials and economic stagnation, drained the treasury. The priesthood of Amun had become so wealthy and powerful they rivaled the pharaoh himself. Egypt entered its third intermediate period, another era of fragmentation, with the country divided between multiple competing dynasties. Libyan mercenaries established their own pharaonic lines. Nubian kings from the south conquered Egypt and ruled as the 25th dynasty, ironically becoming some of the most traditionally Egyptian pharaohs in centuries. But the ancient world was entering a new age. The age of empires built not on divine right, but on military efficiency and bureaucratic organization. In 671 BCE, the Assyrians invaded. Their iron weapons and brutal military tactics overwhelmed Egyptian bronze. For the first time, the ancient civilization faced an enemy that didn't just want tribute, they wanted total control. The Assyrian occupation was brief but devastating. When they were finally expelled, Egypt enjoyed one last moment of independence under the 26th dynasty, but it was an echo of former glory, not a renaissance. Then came the Persians in 525 BCE under Cambyses II. Egypt became a province, a satrapy of the Persian Empire. The pharaohs became Persian-appointed governors. For a civilization that had defined itself by its uniqueness and divine kingship for 3 millennia, this was an identity crisis on a civilizational scale. The Egyptians revolted repeatedly, sometimes successfully regaining independence for brief periods, but they were fighting against history. The age of isolated river valley civilizations was over. The future belonged to vast, multi-ethnic empires connected by trade and held together by professional armies. In 332 BCE, a 24-year-old Macedonian king named Alexander marched into Egypt. But Alexander was no ordinary conqueror. He showed respect for Egyptian religion and culture, visiting the oracle at Siwa Oasis, where he was declared the son of Amun. The Egyptians, exhausted by Persian rule, welcomed him as a liberator. Alexander founded Alexandria on Egypt's Mediterranean coast, a city that would become the intellectual capital of the Hellenistic world. When he died 8 years later, his general Ptolemy took Egypt and established a dynasty that would rule for 3 centuries. The Ptolemaic period was strange. The rulers were Greek, speaking Greek and worshipping Greek gods, yet they adopted pharaonic titles and built temples in traditional Egyptian style. They created a hybrid civilization, Egyptian in outward form but Greek in substance. The most famous Ptolemaic ruler was Cleopatra VII, who ascended the throne in 51 BCE. Popular culture has reduced her to a seductress, but the historical Cleopatra was a political genius who spoke 9 languages. She was the first Ptolemaic ruler to bother learning Egyptian, understood economics, and nearly managed to preserve Egyptian independence through strategic alliances with Rome's most powerful men, Julius Caesar and Mark Antony. But Rome was too powerful. After Cleopatra and Mark Antony's defeat at the Battle of Actium in 31 BCE, Cleopatra chose suicide over capture. She was 39 years old. With her death, ancient Egypt died too. Octavian, soon to become Emperor Augustus, annexed Egypt as a personal possession of the Roman emperor. It was so valuable, producing enough grain to feed the entire city of Rome, that senators were forbidden from even visiting without imperial permission. The pyramids were already ancient ruins. The hieroglyphic script was falling out of use, replaced by Greek and later Coptic. The temples slowly emptied. The old gods were forgotten. Christianity swept across Egypt in the following centuries, transforming the land of the pharaohs into a center of early Christian monasticism. By 391 CE, when the Roman Emperor Theodosius ordered all pagan temples closed, the last hieroglyphic inscription was carved at the Temple of Isis at Philae. Then silence. For over 1,500 years, ancient Egypt existed only as mysterious ruins and biblical references. Medieval travelers stared in wonder at the pyramids, but had no idea who built them or why. The hieroglyphs covering every surface were meaningless decorations. The civilization that had lasted 3,000 years had been completely forgotten. Then, in 1799, French soldiers in Napoleon's army discovered a broken stone near the town of Rosetta. This stone contained the same decree written in 3 scripts: hieroglyphic, demotic, and Greek.
What secret does it hold?
A young French scholar named Jean-François Champollion spent years comparing the texts. In 1822, he had his breakthrough. Hieroglyphics weren't just symbols or pictures. They were a complete language encoding phonetic sounds. The dead language lived again. Suddenly, the temples could speak. The tombs revealed their secrets. An entire lost civilization emerged from the sand. The rediscovery of ancient Egypt in the 19th century sparked Egyptomania throughout Europe and America. Everything from architecture to fashion was influenced by Egyptian motifs. It hasn't really stopped. We're still obsessed with Egypt today, more than 2 centuries later. But here's what makes ancient Egypt truly remarkable. They succeeded in their ultimate goal. They achieved immortality. 3,000 years after their civilization ended, we still speak their names, we study their achievements, we marvel at their monuments. Children around the world learn about their gods and kings. The pharaohs have defeated death after all, not through mummification, but through memory. When Tutankhamun was buried, mourners placed a small wreath of flowers on his coffin. When Howard Carter found it 3,200 years later, those flowers were still there, faded but recognizable. It's one of the most touching moments in archaeology, a sign that these ancient people felt love and loss just as we do. They weren't aliens or magical beings. They were humans who looked at the desert around them and decided to build something eternal. And against all odds, they succeeded. The last speaker of Coptic Egyptian, the direct descendant of the ancient language, died in the 1960s. But scholars can still read hieroglyphics. The last person to worship the Egyptian gods in their original form died over 1,600 years ago. But we still name our pets and children after them. Ancient Egypt lives on, in museums, in movies, in books, in the collective imagination of humanity. Every time someone sketches a pyramid or draws an ankh or dresses as Cleopatra for Halloween, a civilization that died 2 millennia ago comes back to life for a moment. That's the real magic of ancient Egypt. Not the curses or mysteries, but the simple fact that their desperate bid for immortality actually worked. We remember them. We tell their stories, and as long as we do, they live. If this journey through ancient Egypt has fascinated you, if you found yourself wondering how humans could accomplish such incredible things without modern technology, then I need you to do something for me. Hit that like button right now. It tells YouTube to share this video with more history enthusiasts like you. We spent months researching and crafting this documentary to bring you the real story of ancient Egypt, beyond the myths and mysteries. Subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell because we've got an entire series planned exploring the world's greatest ancient civilizations: Rome, Greece, Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley, and more. Each one lasted centuries or even millennia. Each one left an indelible mark on human history, and each one has secrets we're going to uncover together. Drop a comment below and tell me, what aspect of ancient Egypt fascinates you most? The pyramids, the pharaohs, the religion, or is there another ancient civilization you want us to explore next?